I'm going to talk briefly about 4 characteristics of classical education. These are characteristics that are not part of a program, an academic program for classical education, but rather they're part of the ethos of classical education, either things that are causes for what we do in our academic programs, or means of going about our academic program, or results from our academic program. So we're all familiar with the fact that the classical education involves something like a study of great books, a study of classics. We also all know that classical languages usually play a part, that certain classical pedagogies, Socratic questioning, Socratic practice. We are familiar with the fact that math, for instance, in classical schools often takes a more circuitous route in instruction so that students can be taken through the thought processes of those who develop the formulas that give them more efficiency. So even mathematical studies in a classical school are not necessarily aimed toward efficiency as they are toward enlightenment. So these are aspects of the academic program that we're all familiar with. But I want to talk about some things that I'm calling characteristics. And some of this comes from what I understand to be the origins of classical education, and there's something a little bit ironic here, and that is this: that classical education is not actually a product of what we call the classical world. In other words, Plato, for instance, ran a school, but in Plato's time, he and his works were not what we would call classical material. He was within an educational tradition, but what we call the liberal arts tradition, what we call the classical corpus, is really, I think, a product of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. And of course, it's a tradition, and so it continues to grow. But it was a product of scholars, bishops, monks, and others in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages who were building a new civilization, a new Christian civilization, and for certain theological and cultural reasons, made some very prudent and judicious choices about content, arts, and skills, which they brought into an educational practice, which we now call liberal arts or classical education. Now, the classicizing tendency on the part of these early Christian thinkers was not a romanticism. It was not merely a harking back to some previous time that was a wonderful golden age. What caused them to look back to some great works and say, this is something that we want to bring into that we want to pass on to our children. It was not a romanticism. Rather, it was an understanding of the unity of all mankind, which is one of the things I'm going to talk about here in a minute. It was the idea that there are permanent truths rooted in a common nature that all humans share. So, I will talk about 4 characteristics of classical education, and these are the unity of all mankind, a contemplative approach to studies, a humility before great things, and finally, joy. Unity of all mankind. There's a theological assumption that all humans were made in the image of God, which the scholars of the early Christian era or late antiquity assumed, that all humans were made in the image of God. This means that all people of all ages, of all places, of all varying conditions, share a common nature. From this common nature arises common experiences, common aspirations. From these common experiences and aspirations arise expressions or poetic embodiments of these aspirations and experiences. And these tend to be what we call the classics. In the very early ages of the Christian era, St. Justin, the martyr and philosopher, said, "Any truth spoken in any age by any man belongs to Christians." Why is that so? Because all humans of all ages are made in the image of God. To greater and lesser degrees, they have been influenced by, spoken to by the divine Logos. And when we find truth spoken in any place by any person, it belongs to us, he said. Now, it's the common experience of humans sharing a common nature that give rise to the works we call the classics. Again, the classics are not a professorial set of works that have a kind of high sophistication in an elitist sense. Let me give you an example. This is from St. Augustine's Confession, the North African bishop. He told the story of a friend of his named Alypius, who was a Christian. He was with some friends who were not Christian, and they were encouraging him to go along with them to watch the gladiators, the blood sport of the gladiators. He didn't want to go as a Christian. He was tutored not to go see such things, and he tried to resist. But Augustine tells us in wonderful language that with friendly force, they pulled him along. Finally, Alypius gives in to his friends, and he says, "I'll go, but I won't watch." So when they go into the arena, when they go, when they're sitting watching the games, his friends are watching and cheering. He sits with his eyes down. But Augustine tells us that at one point, when two gladiators were fighting, as the thrust was made, the crowd cheered, the crowd roared. And Augustine says the sound entered his ears and opened his eyes. And he looked up and he saw the death thrust. And Augustine says at that moment, he was wounded more deeply in his soul than that man was in his body. Now, what is that story in that work called The Confessions by St. Augustine? What does that story show us? A young man who deceives himself into thinking that he can go along with others to do and to see what he should not do and see, and that he can keep himself from being affected. What Augustine calls friendly force, we tend to call peer pressure. This is a very, very, very old story. And yet, anyone who's a parent will know that this story has relevance. This is the kind of thing students read in a classical school. And this is an example of a classic. Not something dusty, professorial, distant, unattainable, but rather something that speaks to the very experiences that we have in our own lives. This is important for young people. It's important for them to see that I'm not alone in my struggles. I'm not alone in my conflicting thoughts. I'm not alone in my disappointments. I'm not alone in my aspirations. I'm not alone in these things. I belong to a much larger brotherhood of humans who have this conflict of the soul between the rational aspect, the emotions, the desires. I'm not alone in this. So, from our common nature arises common experiences and common aspirations, which are embodied in works, which we then call the classics. It's also very important for young people to be pulled out of their parochial existence, wherein they only tend to listen to others who are just like them and who share their immediate time and place and interests. What a classical education does is pull them out of those images of themselves, pull them out of the echo chamber, pull them out of the cave, and introduce them to a broader community of humans who share their nature and who help them see the way forward toward proper human purpose. That's the unity of all mankind, which undergirds a lot of the reason that we study what we study in classical schools. Now, another important aspect or characteristic of a classical education is a contemplative approach to all that we see and study. One of the common maxims of classical education is do a few things well. Now, even in classical schools, book lists can easily become overwhelming. Everyone can think of 10 more books that students simply must read, 10 more subjects that students simply must have, or 10 more great ideas that we simply must. But what classical schools try to do is to limit to a few good things that act as paradigms for all of the rest of our knowledge. They teach us what the most important ideas are, what the most important insights are, which gives light to all of our other studies. Do a few things well. However, what we find in classical schools that we have to really struggle with is slowing students down. Often we'll have students who come to us and they might announce that they are talented and gifted. Or they might say, I love to read, I'm really going to enjoy this. Or they might even say, oh yeah, I've already read half of the things on the list today, on the list for this year. But we have to slow people down. We have to slow students down. And we have to teach them that we often do things again and again and again. Some of the most important things, some of the most beautiful works, we need to contemplate again and again and again. Imagine if we put a painting up in front of a student. We said, look at this Rembrandt of Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer. Look at it. Okay, now you've seen it, we put it away, and you're never going to look at it again. That's not how we use art, visual art. Nor is it the way we should think about the literary arts or the scientific arts. We have a constant reflection on some of the most important insights. We go over and over and over these things because we are not checking boxes. We are trying to gain insight. In the Middle Ages, a teacher, some people think it was John Meropus or Mavropus, wrote to one of his students and said, "You're really making progress through the curriculum, but I don't want you to be like a Euclidean line, progressing, extending from point to point, but with no other extension. I want you to be like the solids, with breadth and depth. And that's what we want from our students. We want them, of course, to know all of the factual content of history, dates, rivers. We want them to know the factual content of science, mitochondria, the four acidic bases. We want them to master their math facts. But we also want them to spend time asking that question that some teachers find annoying, which is, what does this have to do with anything? Not only do we welcome that question, we want that question. We want to keep asking that question, and we want to keep pulling students up from the concrete details of any of the subject areas to say, what is this showing us about the world? What is this showing us this about ourselves? What is this showing us about human purpose? Now, I mentioned that we often have to slow students down. I've seen a practice in classical schools whereby teachers with students on field trips find ways to slow the students down from just having a chat walk on a field trip. In other words, preparing them ahead of time for what they're going to see, giving them the language of the kinds of things they're going to see. For instance, one group that was visiting in Santa Fe, two cathedrals, very different architectural styles, one mission style, one Gothic style. And preparing them ahead of time with the vocabulary of the two styles, and then on the field trip, having students stand across the street, do a sketch, label with the words they've learned which aspects they saw. This slows students down, makes them look and pay attention in a way that they might not when you are simply walking past the building and saying, Gothic, mission, right? Now, there are a lot of other ways to encourage contemplation as well, and it's a hard thing, especially in our time when our children live lives of distraction and fragmentation. We really need to be intentional about this, and we probably need to start with them when they're very young. But often you will find in classical schools that children will be asked to listen to something for an extended period of time, to look at something for an extended period of time, and then to discuss what they have seen, discuss what they have heard. This is all part of encouraging contemplation. Now, think about this. There's another common story that everyone knows, Aesop's story of the tortoise and the hare. And you know that they have a race. And of course, the hare is confident that he can win. He runs ahead. He takes a break, sits down, goes to sleep. The tortoise keeps plodding along and ultimately wins. And we often think of the moral of that story as slow and steady wins the race. A translation of one of the Greek morals of that story is often hard work is victorious over natural ability. So again, we find in asking students to slow down so that they can see that we have to take the students who have natural abilities and convince them, and often convince their parents, that reading something again is not only okay, but it's necessary. That taking longer to work through a certain sequence of concepts in math is okay. That taking a Euclidean approach to studying the concepts in math is okay. One British mathematician described the difference in the efficiency of algebra and the slow and thoughtful Euclidean approach as the difference in hiking over a mountain and tunneling through a mountain. He said, tunneling through the mountain is much more efficient, it's direct, it gets you where you need to go quickly, but you go through in darkness. Whereas, he said, you hike over the top, it's hard, it takes longer, it doesn't really always make sense, but you see everything. And that was his analogy for comparing an approach that classical schools will often use, even in math. Now, I would say this, in science as well, classical schools want to achieve not merely a dogmatic presentation of the structures of the physical world, but a contemplation of the inner essences of things. The Church Fathers referred to theoria physicae, the contemplation of nature. All of nature has energies that come from God. And we are not only interested in structures, we are not only interested in utility, but we're interested in the life of God and the world of God as His creation. And that can be seen in so many places when we slow down, when we become quiet, when we guide the students in looking into things and not merely mastering the terms, mastering the processes, and checking the boxes. Good things need to be visited again and again. Insights lie awaiting the attentive, but we must be quiet, attentive. We must teach our students patience. And in this way, through this meditative approach, they learn the lessons that are embodied in the fabric of the world. Now, another characteristic of classical education is humility. Now, we talk a lot about goodness, and we talk about greatness. We talk about virtue as a kind of excellence. These terms all seem superlative, and they are. But the effect of guiding students to contemplate the highest and the best, we hope, inspires them. It shows them what's possible. It shows them what's possible for them. It shows them what's possible for imperfect people just like them. But it should cause in us, it should guide us to bow down in admiration and in gratitude to the things that are higher and better that we find in the world. It should create in us a humility. We see examples of nobility and virtue. We don't shield them from examples of failure, of cruelty, but we show them the great potential in human life and the great potential in human society. And we show them in then human makings, which are a subcreation and imitation of God, human makings, that is, works of arts of all kinds, the highest and the best. And that gives our students an idea of goodness, of greatness, of better. And they won't achieve all of these things, but they can achieve higher formations of their own character, higher collaborations within their own community, and higher makings, artistic makings of their own choosing, when they love the beauty of goodness and of form, and when they see it and when they venerate it in other great works of human imagination and human art. So, The apprehension of good things should not call forth the minute scrutiny that insists on finding some flaw in anything, but rather appreciation of the good achieved in spite of all the limitations of human nature and of human communities. So, humility is a characteristic in our schools. And then finally, joy. You know, people don't usually just jump up and down ecstatically when they get participation ribbons. Classical schools tend to put their students through a rather rigorous program of studies with rather complex and weighty material. In fact, classical schools might ask something of a student that could seem very superfluous, like mastery of penmanship. Someone might say, I can't do that, my hand won't do it. But again, it is a common practice in classical schools to help students master not only physical activities that produce things like penmanship, to intellectual acts that don't come naturally to them. We won't necessarily divide students out into the visual spatial learners or the verbal linguistic learners, but rather we see these as arts that everybody needs to master, and it's going to be hard for everyone, but we're going to break it down and teach you the art and practice and practice and practice, and you're going to be better. What happens is that when a student who didn't know things and was perplexed and couldn't understand lessons of a certain kind in September, but gets the necessary information filled in, and in January and in February is beginning to pull it all together. When the student has that experience, when a student has the experience of not being able to execute a specific task, again, just take handwriting, but they are guided through intentional practice and practice and practice, and sometime later they have mastered it. And they own it, and it has become part of their abilities. There is joy in that kind of accomplishment. Young people enjoy seeing the progress in knowledge, in understanding, in ability that comes through time, hard work, patience, and practice. Practice, practice. There's a joy. There's a real joy in it. It's a sad thing that some schools, some professional educators rob students of those experiences by trying to differentiate to too great a degree according to a student's natural ability or innate ability or personal preferences, rather than showing them all that they are capable of learning and doing. There's a joy in it, a great joy in it. Another kind of joy that is characteristic of classical education, I would say, is this. In spite of the fact that we introduce students to human life in its highest, noblest, most beautiful, and most troubling and problematic aspects, in spite of the fact that we show them this array of human potential, array of human action, nevertheless, there is always a message of hope. That is, that not only is there the mere possibility, like the flip of a coin, that you could go one way or the other, but rather that you are called to a higher life, a higher character, a higher potential. You are called to this. And you have companions on this road. And you have help, human help and superhuman help in achieving the highest ends to which you are called. There's joy in that. There's joy in the accomplishment of good things. There's joy in the presentation of what humans are and what humans can be, in spite of the negative characteristics of human life that are always going to be part of the narrative. So they have that goal as well. Most profoundly, students in a classical school are taught to contemplate who they are, what the human community is, what we are called to, and that is to a brotherhood of the broader human community, and to what the Church Fathers called theosis, participation in the divine nature. And that this call is not a futile call. We can make progress toward these goods. So, we have the call, we have guides, we have examples, we have companions, and we have a nature. We are made in the image of God. We have a nature that inclines us toward the good. The good being to become persons, restoring the likeness to the image of God, sustaining human communities in love, moving ourselves and others toward the higher goods, from glory to glory, from humanitas to participation in the divine nature. These, I see, are significant characteristics that undergird a classical education. Thank you.